views. Is there a space for that?
First of all, thank you very much, Juan, for having me here today. And also, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. You have put your hand at a very important point. Indeed, Asia is the growth pole of the world economy, and it has learned to widen up its policy space. In fact, Asia this time is rethinking and reinvesting in itself. If it has traded itself out of the crisis in 1997, this time round it has financed itself out of the crisis. But at the same time, it is challenged. It is challenged with a question on how can the region sustain its growth, its wealth generation, and the dynamism in the medium term beyond the exit of its expansionary policies. Because Asia, whilst it has its economic powerhouses, it has great inequalities and growing inequalities. Just to give you some figure, the national income share of the top 20% of the population has steadily increased, while that of the bottom 20% has decreased. And across the countries, LDCs has displayed only a quarter of the average income level of all Asia-Pacific countries, despite the high growth of the region as a whole. Now, the fact that it cannot trade itself out of the crisis precisely because the developed countries have to restrain their debt fuel consumption in coming years as they unwind their global imbalances, Asia is rethinking itself in terms of how does it generate alternative sources of demand. And in fact, how does it mitigate the potential loss of demand in the West? And in so doing, it has taken the challenge of inequality and poverty reduction. People are talking about this at the policy level. With 980 million people in poverty and wide gaps remaining in the MDG achievements, infrastructure and other development gaps between and within the countries, the region indeed has much headroom for expanding aggregate demand for sustaining growth, if it can deal with these issues and if it can actually build on income security. Now, by focusing attention on poverty reduction and closing development gaps, in fact, the challenge can be turned into an opportunity. And in this way, poverty reduction, inclusive growth, and MDG achievement would be critical. It is seen as critical for sustaining the region's new drivers of growth in the coming years. Now, what are the policy agendas, the 5 policy points, the 5 points agenda that the region has been talking about? One that has been brought up several times is the need for job-led growth. In fact, its wealth has been generated recently, unfortunately, through greater capital inflows and speculative capital inflows as that, what has been referred to as a downside risk. And therefore, the shift to greater incentive for job creation, especially in the situation of uncertainty and risk and the volatility that we have seen. I think the need for decent jobs and better quality jobs, because whatever it is, many of the jobs are still in the informal sector. And with the need to try to deal with the labour market segmentation is still a critical issue. So the role of the market in that it would be critical. I think the role of the fact that the financial crisis came together also with other crises, including the food fuel price volatility, is critical because that price and food price changes, the volatility has in fact pushed in 2011 alone 42 million people in Asia back into poverty, even though the high growth in China, in India, and in the middle-income countries have gotten more than half of the people out of the poverty equation. And therefore, to reverse the neglect of agriculture in public policy is something that many countries are doing, focusing on agricultural growth and on rural development, because many of the poor people are still in the rural sector. And therefore, investing, especially in small farmers and in food security in the context of sustainable agriculture. In fact, countries like Indonesia is in fact talking about a new green revolution based on sustainable agriculture. I think the third issue that's on the policy agenda is actually financing for development, building the capacities of the least developed countries through inclusive financing, and the poor through inclusive financing to build up their productive capacities so that they can actually participate in the market. And I think here the role of the market and the state is also critical, because the role of the state in Asia has been critical. In fact, many of the states have been developmental states, and states that deals with redistribution, be it in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, and also in terms of closing some of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure gaps. Very quickly, I think the other fourth agenda is the closing of the infrastructure gaps. In fact, we have shown that what is needed if we are to deal with the infrastructure gap, Asia needs something like $800 billion per annum. And these are huge investments that has brought into play public-private partnership, but also a rethinking about how do we develop a regional financial architecture that could not take place in the 1997 financial crisis, because the Monetary Fund at that time was not very supportive of it. But what are the elements of this regional financial architecture that can actually use the reserves that were accumulated from the 1997 financial crisis of over $5 trillion, and how to, in fact, use this to invest in closing the development gaps, including the infrastructure gap. And finally, the development of a regional market, stronger regional market, and open forms of regionalism in the context of globalization. And here, the issue of connectivity is a critical one. ESCAP has been pushing the agenda with ASEAN +6 on the regional connectivity agenda, where many of the stimulus packages has been spent on looking at how do you upgrade the Asian highway, how do you upgrade the Trans-Asian Railway, how do you create an intermodal transport system, how do we negotiate now for a dry port treaties so that we can build economic corridors that bring into play the landlocked countries, the least developed countries, and to link them with the more prosperous coastal areas of Asia. But I think one of the critical things, because Asia has taken the lead, and I'm sure we'll hear from Korea in the G20 for a long time, is to deal with price volatility. And that is a critical, and how can the G20 actually put a bandwidth across the volatility in food, in fuel, as well as in the commodity. So the issue of economic governance and Asia's role in that is also very, very, very critical. And I just want very quickly to end by saying that it is the need for social protection is absolutely critical, and this is not seen as a cost anymore, but is seen as an investment in building up what you have called the social floor, in order to ensure that there's income security to participate in the market. And in this, when we're talking about the connectivity agenda, it is not just the hardware of connectivity, but also the software of connectivity, where there is trade regimes being integrated, because there are the noodle bowl effect in Asia, where many countries trade at the bilateral level. And here, I just want to say that the software of connectivity, and I would end here, has to take into account the changing population patterns in Asia, where there's also an aging population together with the rise in youth population in some countries. And therefore, the issue of how do we invest in the care economy is critical as well. So let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Noeleen, for a very comprehensive answer. I think